Hendersonville, Tennessee, March 23rd, 1972, 7:43 p.m. Johnny Cash sat alone in his private recording studio, the heavy wooden door locked behind him, holding the advance copy of Elvis Presley's new gospel album, He Touched Me, that had arrived that morning from RCA Records. The man in black had been looking forward to this moment all day, curious to hear what Elvis had done with the sacred music that meant so much to both of them. June Carter Cash had noticed Johnny's anticipation as he carried the album to his studio after dinner, promising her he'd be back soon to help put the children to bed. But what happened next would keep Johnny locked in that studio for 3 hours, experiencing an emotional and spiritual encounter so profound that it would change his understanding of both Elvis Presley and the power of gospel music forever. As the opening notes of He Touched Me filled the studio, Johnny felt something he hadn't expected, tears beginning to form in his eyes. By the time Elvis reached the first chorus, Johnny was crying openly, overwhelmed by the raw spiritual power and authentic faith pouring through his speakers. When the album finished playing, Johnny immediately started it over, and then again, unable to process what he was experiencing. For 3 straight hours, the man in black sat in his studio, alternating between tears of joy and moments of profound spiritual revelation, convinced he was hearing something sacred. Finally, at 11:17 p.m., Johnny picked up the phone and dialed a number he had memorized years earlier. When Elvis answered, Johnny could barely speak through his emotions. "Elvis," Johnny said, his voice thick with tears. "I just heard your album. It's not just music, brother. It's holy. It's the closest thing to heaven I've ever heard on this earth." This is the documented story of the night Johnny Cash encountered the divine through Elvis Presley's gospel music, the phone call that lasted until dawn, and how 2 legends discovered that their friendship was deeper than music. It was a spiritual bond that would sustain them both through the darkest periods of their lives. The relationship between Johnny Cash and Elvis Presley had always been built on mutual respect and shared understanding of the unique pressures that came with being cultural icons in American music. But beneath their professional admiration lay something deeper, a shared faith that had shaped both men since childhood and continued to influence their approach to music and life. Both Johnny and Elvis had grown up in poverty-stricken families where church was not just a weekly obligation, but a source of hope, community, and spiritual sustenance that made the hardships of daily life bearable. Gospel music wasn't just one genre among many for these men. It was the foundation of their musical identity and the wellspring of their most authentic emotional expression. Johnny and Elvis both understood that gospel music wasn't about performing, observed Reverend Jimmy Snow, who knew both men personally. It was about testifying, about sharing your relationship with God through song. When they sang gospel, they weren't entertainers. They were witnesses. This shared understanding of gospel music as a form of spiritual communication had deepened Johnny and Elvis's friendship over the years, even as their careers took different paths. While their rock and country music might compete on the charts, their gospel recordings existed in a different realm entirely, where commercial success was secondary to spiritual authenticity. The creation of Elvis's He Touched Me album in 1971 and early 1972 represented one of the most personally meaningful projects of his entire career. Following the critical and commercial success of his earlier gospel album, How Great Thou Art, Elvis had approached this new collection of sacred songs with even greater spiritual intensity and artistic ambition. Elvis was different when he was working on gospel material, recalled Felton Jarvis, who produced the album. He would spend hours listening to different versions of songs, praying before recording sessions, talking about what each song meant to him personally. It wasn't just another album. It was his way of sharing his faith with the world. The recording sessions for He Touched Me had taken place over several months, with Elvis taking an unusually active role in song selection and arrangement. Unlike his secular recordings, which were often chosen by his management team based on commercial considerations, Elvis personally selected every song on the gospel album based on its spiritual significance and his emotional connection to the message. The title track, "He Touched Me," written by Bill Gaither, had particularly moved Elvis during the recording process. The song's message about spiritual transformation and divine intervention resonated deeply with Elvis's own understanding of how faith had sustained him through the challenges of fame and personal struggle. Elvis would get emotional every time he sang "He Touched Me," remembered gospel singer J.D. Sumner, who provided backing vocals on the album. You could see that he was singing from his heart, sharing something real about his relationship with God. It wasn't performance, it was testimony. Johnny Cash had been eagerly anticipating the release of "He Touched Me" since learning about the project through mutual friends in Nashville's music community. Johnny understood better than most people how important gospel music was to Elvis, and he was curious to hear how Elvis had grown spiritually since their last personal conversation several months earlier. The advance copy of the album had arrived at Johnny's house that morning, along with a handwritten note from Elvis. "Johnny, I hope this album speaks to your heart, the way these songs spoke to mine while I was recording them. Your brother in Christ, Elvis." Johnny had been touched by the personal nature of Elvis's note, recognizing it as more than just professional courtesy. The phrase "brother in Christ" reflected the spiritual bond that had developed between them over the years, a connection that transcended their status as entertainment icons. After dinner on March 23rd, Johnny had retreated to his private studio, a converted outbuilding on his property, where he could listen to music, write songs, and pray without interruption. The studio was Johnny's sanctuary, equipped with high-quality audio equipment, but designed more for contemplation than production. Johnny placed the album on his turntable and settled into his favorite listening chair, expecting to enjoy Elvis's latest gospel offering, but unprepared for the spiritual experience that was about to overwhelm him. From the opening notes of "He Touched Me," Johnny knew he was hearing something extraordinary. Elvis's voice carried a depth of spiritual conviction and emotional authenticity that seemed to transform the recording studio into a sacred space. Each word was delivered with such heartfelt sincerity that Johnny felt like he was eavesdropping on a private conversation between Elvis and God. Shackled by a heavy burden, 'neath a load of guilt and shame, then the hand of Jesus touched me. And now I am no longer the same. As Elvis sang these opening lines, Johnny felt tears beginning to form in his eyes. The vulnerability and honesty in Elvis's voice was unlike anything Johnny had heard in contemporary gospel music. This wasn't polished church performance, it was raw, personal testimony, delivered with the kind of spiritual authority that could only come from genuine faith experience. The second song, "I've Got Confidence," continued building the emotional and spiritual intensity that had captured Johnny's attention. Elvis's interpretation of Andraé Crouch's composition demonstrated not just vocal technique, but deep understanding of the song's message about trusting in divine guidance during uncertain times. Johnny found himself completely absorbed in the album, his usual critical listening habits replaced by pure emotional and spiritual response. He wasn't analyzing Elvis's vocal performance or production choices. He was experiencing something that felt like worship, like being present in a service where genuine spiritual transformation was taking place. John, brought Johnny to his first moment of overwhelming emotion. Elvis's rendition of this powerful song about the Apostle John's vision of Christ was delivered with such dramatic intensity and spiritual conviction that Johnny felt transported to the biblical scene itself. When Elvis reached the climactic moment, "I saw him, yes, I saw him," Johnny broke down completely, sobbing with an intensity that surprised and overwhelmed him. The tears weren't just emotional response to beautiful music. They were the result of spiritual recognition, the sense that he was hearing something sacred and transformative. Johnny had heard hundreds of gospel recordings throughout his life, had recorded many himself, but Elvis's album was affecting him on a level that transcended musical appreciation. Amazing Grace and Seeing is Believing continued the spiritual journey that was unfolding in Johnny's studio. Each song seemed to build upon the previous one, creating a cohesive statement of faith that felt more like a revival service than a recording project. By the time Elvis reached A Thing Called Love, Johnny was experiencing something approaching religious ecstasy. The combination of Elvis's passionate vocal delivery and the song's message about divine love had created an atmosphere in Johnny's studio that felt genuinely holy. When the album finished, Johnny sat in stunned silence for several minutes, trying to process what he had just experienced. Then, without consciously deciding to do so, he started the album over from the beginning, needing to confirm that what he had heard was real, and not just the product of an unusually emotional evening. The second listening was even more powerful than the first. Now that Johnny knew what was coming, he could focus on the spiritual craftsmanship that Elvis had brought to each song, the careful attention to message and meaning that elevated the entire project beyond mere entertainment. During Somebody Bigger Than You and I, Johnny found himself praying along with Elvis, feeling like he was participating in a worship service rather than listening to a recording. The line between performer and listener seemed to dissolve as Johnny experienced the album as a form of shared spiritual communion. The third time through the album brought new revelations and deeper emotional response. Johnny began to understand that what Elvis had created wasn't just a collection of gospel songs. It was a complete statement of faith, a musical testimony that revealed the depth of Elvis's spiritual life in ways that his public image never suggested. By this point, Johnny had been in his studio for nearly 3 hours, alternating between tears of joy and moments of profound spiritual contemplation. June had checked on him twice, knocking gently on the studio door, but Johnny had asked her to give him more time, unable to explain what he was experiencing, but knowing he wasn't ready to return to the ordinary world outside his studio. As Johnny listened to He Touched Me for the 4th time that evening, he realized he needed to share what he was experiencing with the person who had created it. The spiritual impact of the album was so profound that Johnny felt compelled to contact Elvis immediately, despite the late hour and the fact that Elvis was probably performing in Las Vegas at that time. At 11:17 p.m., Johnny finally picked up the phone in his studio and dialed Elvis's private number, which he had memorized during their years of friendship. He wasn't sure if Elvis would answer. It was nearly midnight in Tennessee, which meant it was past 10 p.m. in Las Vegas. But Johnny felt an urgent need to share his experience while the emotions were still raw and immediate. Elvis answered on the 3rd ring, his voice suggesting that he had been awake despite the late hour. "Hello?" "Elvis, it's Johnny," Johnny said, his voice thick with emotion and hoarse from crying. "I hope I'm not calling too late, but I had to talk to you tonight." "Johnny, brother, you can call me anytime. What's going on? You sound upset." "I'm not upset, Elvis. I don't know what I am. I just finished listening to your new album, and I've been crying for 3 hours straight. I've never heard anything like it in my life." There was a moment of silence on the line as Elvis processed Johnny's words. Then Elvis spoke, with a voice full of emotion and genuine surprise. "Johnny, that means everything to me. Those songs, they came from the deepest part of my heart. I prayed over every one of them, asking God to let me share something real about my faith." "You did, brother. Oh, you did." "Elvis, I've been listening to gospel music my whole life. I've recorded gospel albums myself, but what you've done on this record, it's not just music, it's holy. It's like you opened a direct line to heaven and let us listen in." The conversation that followed would last until nearly dawn, becoming one of the most spiritually significant exchanges in either man's life. For nearly 4 hours, Johnny Cash and Elvis Presley shared their deepest thoughts about faith, music, and the responsibility that came with being able to reach millions of people through their art. Johnny told me that listening to Elvis's album was like attending the most powerful church service he'd ever experienced. June Carter Cash wrote in her diary entry for March 24th, 1972. He said Elvis's voice carried such spiritual authority that Johnny felt like he was hearing the voice of an angel. I've never seen my husband so moved by music in all the years I've known him. During their marathon phone conversation, Johnny and Elvis discussed specific songs from the album and their personal spiritual significance. Johnny was particularly moved by Elvis's interpretation of "He Touched Me," which he felt captured the essence of spiritual transformation in a way that was both universally meaningful and deeply personal. "Johnny, when I was recording that song," Elvis told him during their call, "I kept thinking about how Jesus touched the lepers and the blind and the brokenhearted. I wanted to sing it like someone who had been touched and healed, like someone who knew what it felt like to be changed by divine love." "You succeeded, brother," Johnny replied. "When you sang, 'And now I am no longer the same,' I felt like I was hearing your personal testimony, like you were sharing the moment when God changed your life." The spiritual intimacy of their conversation deepened as both men shared stories about their faith journeys, their struggles with the pressures of fame, and their desire to use their musical gifts to serve something greater than their own success. Elvis spoke about how gospel music had sustained him through the darkest periods of his life, how singing sacred songs was the one time he felt completely authentic and unguarded. Johnny shared his own experiences with addiction, depression, and spiritual redemption, explaining how his faith had literally saved his life during his struggles with amphetamines in the 1960s. "We both understood that our success was a gift from God," Johnny later reflected, "and that we had a responsibility to use that gift to point people towards something greater than entertainment." Elvis's gospel album did that better than anything I'd ever heard. The climax of their conversation came when both men felt moved to pray together over the phone. This wasn't planned or forced. It emerged naturally from their discussion about faith and their shared sense that they were experiencing something sacred through their friendship. "Elvis suggested we pray together," Johnny recalled years later. "Not about anything specific, just to thank God for the friendship we had and for the opportunity to serve him through music." We both got emotional during that prayer. There was something powerful about two men, hundreds of miles apart, joining their hearts in gratitude to God. The prayer they shared lasted nearly 10 minutes, with both men taking turns expressing their gratitude for their friendship, their music, and their faith. According to Johnny's later recollections, the prayer included specific thanks for the spiritual impact of Elvis's gospel album and a request for God's blessing on their continued efforts to serve him through their art. "When we finished praying," Johnny remembered, "there was this incredible sense of peace and brotherhood between us. I felt closer to Elvis after that phone call than I did to almost anyone else in my life. We had shared something sacred, something that went way beyond the music business or even our friendship. We had touched the divine together." The conversation finally ended around 4:30 a.m. Central Time, with both men exhausted but spiritually renewed by their marathon discussion. Elvis was due to perform that evening in Las Vegas, but he told Johnny that their conversation had given him new energy and inspiration for his shows. "Brother, this has been one of the most important nights of my life," Elvis told Johnny as they prepared to hang up. "Knowing that the album touched you the way it did, that tells me we're doing God's work through our music. That's all I've ever wanted." "Elvis, you are doing God's work," Johnny replied. "Your voice on that album is closer to God than anything I've ever heard from a human being. Don't ever doubt that your gospel music is a ministry, because it is." The impact of that night's experience extended far beyond Johnny's personal appreciation for Elvis's album. The spiritual encounter fundamentally changed Johnny's understanding of Elvis as both an artist and a person, revealing depths of faith and authenticity that Elvis's public image rarely suggested. After that night, Johnny talked about Elvis differently, observed Chris Christopherson, who was close to Johnny during this period. He would tell people that Elvis was one of the most spiritually gifted men he had ever known, that Elvis's gospel singing was a form of ministry that reached people in ways that traditional preaching never could. Johnny's experience with "He Touched Me" also influenced his own approach to gospel music in the years that followed. The spiritual authenticity he had heard in Elvis's album became a benchmark for his own sacred recordings, inspiring Johnny to dig deeper into his own faith experience when selecting and interpreting gospel songs. The album "He Touched Me" went on to win Elvis his third and final Grammy Award for Best Inspirational Performance. But for Johnny Cash, the album's significance transcended any commercial or critical recognition. It represented a spiritual achievement that demonstrated the power of authentic faith expression through music. Johnny kept the advance copy of "He Touched Me" in his studio for the rest of his life, often playing it during times when he needed spiritual encouragement or inspiration. The album became a touchstone for Johnny's understanding of what gospel music could accomplish when performed with complete sincerity and spiritual conviction. The friendship between Johnny and Elvis was deepened and sanctified by their shared experience with the gospel album and the profound conversation it prompted. Both men carried the memory of that night as evidence that their relationship existed on a spiritual plane that transcended the ordinary bonds of professional friendship. Johnny would tell me about that phone call with Elvis whenever he was struggling with doubt or discouragement. June Carter Cash recalled, "It became a source of strength for him, proof that God was working through their friendship and their music in ways that were bigger than either of them understood." The story of Johnny Cash's emotional response to "He Touched Me" became legendary within gospel music circles, though both Johnny and Elvis kept the details of their marathon phone conversation private during their lifetimes. The intimacy and spiritual significance of that night was too sacred to share with the public, representing something that belonged to their friendship and their faith, rather than to their fans or the media. Years later, after Elvis's death in 1977, Johnny would often speak publicly about the spiritual power of Elvis's gospel recordings and the profound faith that motivated them. Johnny became one of Elvis's most passionate advocates for recognition as a gospel artist, arguing that Elvis's sacred music represented his greatest artistic achievement. "People remember Elvis for his rock and roll, and that's understandable," Johnny said in a 1985 interview. "But his gospel music was where his heart lived, where his real spiritual gifts were displayed." When Elvis sang gospel, he wasn't performing. He was testifying, witnessing, sharing his relationship with God. That album, "He Touched Me," is one of the holiest things ever recorded. The legacy of that March night in 1972 extends beyond the personal impact on Johnny and Elvis to encompass broader questions about the relationship between popular music and spiritual expression. In an industry often characterized by superficiality and commercial calculation, the genuine spiritual communication between these two legends demonstrated that authentic faith could still find expression through contemporary music. For contemporary gospel artists and spiritual musicians, the story of Johnny's response to Elvis's album serves as inspiration and validation that sacred music can still move hearts and change lives when performed with complete authenticity and spiritual conviction. The story also illustrates the profound bonds that can develop between artists who share not just professional respect, but spiritual kinship. Johnny and Elvis's friendship was deepened and sanctified by their shared commitment to using their musical gifts in service of their faith, creating a relationship that sustained both men through the challenges of their careers and personal lives. In a broader sense, the story of that night represents the power of authentic artistic expression to transcend entertainment and become genuine spiritual communication. When Elvis sang gospel with complete honesty and spiritual conviction, And when Johnny received that music with an open heart, prepared for spiritual encounter, something sacred occurred that changed both men forever. The 3 hours Johnny Cash spent crying alone in his studio while listening to He Touched Me, and the 4-hour phone conversation that followed represent one of the most spiritually significant encounters in American music history. A moment when two legends discovered that their friendship existed not just in the realm of entertainment, but in the eternal domain of shared faith and divine calling. The Man in Black and the King of Rock and Roll found something that night that was more precious than fame, success, or critical acclaim. They found spiritual brotherhood, sacred friendship, and confirmation that their musical gifts were indeed instruments of divine grace, in a world that desperately needed to hear the message of hope and redemption that flowed through their voices when they sang of their faith.